So continuing on, we'll move within the Seascribe tools to looking at the dives. So I'm going to just scroll back down here to our last Neptune cruise in June again. Here it is. Getting used to a different computer here. So I'm going to click to go into that cruise the view dives portion. Will allow me to see all the dives that we had entered in that expedition. So here, all these upper columns are sortable. So these are different metadata aspects of each dive. So if I go across, we have our dive ID that's internal to our database, but as well there is this ROV dive ID that you can enter yourself. The dive ID over here in the database is automatically chosen, so it's not necessarily following any specific convention to the ROV or to the cruise, but here you have an opportunity to follow what convention that you would like to follow. The current dive column indicates that it's the current dive underway. Again, this won't be so important for the NOAA expeditions, as this is used to drive which dive metadata to display on our website during an active dive. The area is the geographical area where the dive is occurring. The date from, date to is the time range of the dive. You'll notice that I have this upper level ONC 0009. That's actually what we use for, we also use this tool for our deck logs as well as our ROV dives. And then we have the dive objectives over here. And you can sort any of these columns, so you can rearrange by the geographical area or the time, however you would like to. And then you can add a dive with this button on the this red button here, and it will create a new dive. And you can enter all the metadata for when you're beginning a dive. And so this will be done. This will have to be figured out within your expeditions who will be responsible for creating the dives as you're proceeding, but it should default to the appropriate expedition. And then you'll have to select the platform that you're annotating on. So in your case, it would be the Deep Discover. So it's ROV Deep Discover, and then you could enter your dive objectives, the area that you happen to be surveying, who is the dive chief, and so we'll need to actually get a list of the personnel to add to this potential list of dive chiefs for your expeditions. I don't know where the scrolling bar is.
2 fingers.
Oh. And then the date from, date to of the dive. Often you don't know the exact time range at the start of the dive, so you can estimate the date to and then refine it when the dive is actually over. Here's where you can set that active flag, which again won't have much utility for the NOAA cruises. The C-tube red flag is actually quite important. This is the flag that decides whether or not that dive will show in our C-tube interface. So generally you'll want to check this flag, but if you need to obscure that or hide that dive for any particular reason, for any kind of sensitive footage or anything that you'd like to hide the entire dive, or you're not prepared to show it yet, you can hide it with this flag, and you can uncheck it and recheck it at any time later on. The default camera for C-tube, this is mainly handy when you have multiple cameras on an ROV, and so that it'll immediately go to the main camera in C-tube. Since we're only going to be archiving video for one camera on the ROV, this won't be that important, and we'll only have an option for one camera. So it won't matter whether or not it's actually selected, but you'll see when we get to C-tube where that actually can be useful. The observations tab, so I haven't saved this dive, so I can't actually create observations yet. I'm going to go back and look at a historical dive. So just getting used to this 2-finger thing. If we look at a historical dive, I can click on the ID that's highlighted, hyperlinked here, and I can then go to see all the dive log for that particular dive. It sorts by default in reverse order, assuming that for live dive logging operations, you'll want the most recent entries at the top. And the auto refresh, I have it checked off right now, but by checking it on, it will continue to update. So that's handy when you have an active dive and multiple loggers, that they can see the entries that the other loggers are making as they're created, and syncing between systems. But you can change these ordering if you'd like to go in chronological order, or sort by any of these headings. The metadata here that's showing is the observation ID that it's automatically populating in the database. The UTC time, this will come from the time server, either on the ship for the people that are logging on board, or from our time server of our shore-based web server for the shore loggers. The description is simply the annotation. I'll describe the tags more in detail, but that's a special way of filtering for certain types of annotations, and we have our own ONC tags, but you'll be able to, in the future, develop your own tag system for your own filtering purposes. The resource name is allowing you to tag or annotate instruments on the platform specifically. Most of the time you're logging what you see or the dive in general, but on occasion you might be wanting to enter a comment that is particular to one of the instruments. So here's some examples where we are, manipulating the camera in a particular way, and we want to capture that this is a particular camera that we're talking about, especially when we have multiple cameras, or if we're doing something with the temperature probe or whatever. So it allows you to annotate specifically to an instrument on the platform. This particular dive doesn't show the lat long depth heading information until we're closer to the sea floor. This is just due to how the JSON navigate. We were using the JSON ROV at the time, and the JSON navigation doesn't record until we're near the bottom, and so we don't actually have those variables during the water column, which other systems that we use do. So depending, your ROV system, I believe, would have it throughout the, there would be attributions of latitude, longitude, depth, heading for any annotations throughout the dive. And then whoever is last modified or entered that annotation's name will be showing on the far right. So if we go to create an observation, you can see this is the observation screen where we can enter. You can also use shortcuts, Control E to enter an annotation and Control S to save your annotation. But of course you can use the buttons. And it defaults to the dive as the resource, but if you'd like to change it to another instrument, that resource, this is your drop-down menu where you can do that, and we've already set up in advance what instruments would be available on that platform for annotating. And then the timestamp is automatically entered as right now, so this is right now's timestamp. It's throwing me an alert right now because I'm pretending I'm annotating a dive that's in the past, and it had a date range in June, so it's letting me know that this annotation doesn't make sense right now for this particular dive. So if you were to have a time within the range, it wouldn't have that text. These tags are, again, those tags I mentioned for filtering. These are the ones that we've been using at ONC, but you'll have an opportunity in a few months to set your own tags that allow you to filter. And then this is a free-form annotation area where you can enter whatever you'd like. We, of course, do have conventions and syntax and vocabularies that we're following within ONC. And so these are assisted, first of all, by these drop-down menus that allow us to enter particular annotations that make sense for our own operations, or well, there's operations. We also have a drop-down for biological observations, for sampling of physical samples. Seafloor is for our seafloor substrate, following the CMECS convention there for the vocabulary. We also have entries or syntax for surveys, deploying experiments, for temperature probe insertions, etc. So these are kind of like helper syntax tools, each of these drop-down menus. And so by just selecting one of these items, it will populate in the description, and then the user would just edit the missing components, or the components that they're meant to edit. And these, in our ONC dive logging operations, we have a manual that accompanies the dive loggers, that follows their training in the first place, that allows them to know how these syntax work, what kind of information they're supposed to enter for these, say, X's, when are they supposed to use them. So we have an extensive module with all these conventions and how we use them at ONC. So you might want to develop something like that yourselves, or if you're interested, you can have access to ours and utilize those yourself. Those are the main components within the overview, and I can go into more detail if there's specific questions later on, but that's the main things I wanted to note here. And then I also just wanted to quickly mention, because this might be beneficial to you when you start to develop your annotating program with Seascribe, that our typical logger stations will have the video, like I mentioned. They'll have the Seascribe system. We'll also have generally some kind of way of communicating with the ROV pilots, whether we're wearing a headset or in the same room, but usually a headset. And even when we're on shore logging, often we'll have ability to talk to either the dive chief or the ROV pilots. So having some way of communicating verbally often helps if you're trying to clarify what you're seeing, or asking them to pause and zoom in on something. Not sure if you'll have that capability for everyone, but it definitely helps when we're logging to have that immediacy to the ROV pilot and the dive chief. And then they also tend to use the dive loggers as a resource, because you know, they were wanting, oh, can you go back in the logs and check on something for us, or so it's a back and forth. It's a two-way resource. Then the other thing that I wanted to mention is when we're preparing, we always do this training, not just of the tool but of our own conventions. We have to set up the permissions, so that's something that we'll be setting up in advance with you. Just a reminder for everyone to create accounts in Notions 2.0 if you haven't already. Then we'll also be configuring that platform so that the right instruments populate in the drop-down list, and making sure that the video recording and streaming is all set up. I also would encourage that you might have some kind of backup plans if you are doing some main logging activities on shore, if your satellite goes down, or how you would inform the ship that you no longer have that feed. So we always come up with some kind of backup plans depending on the system. And then we also have someone that's sort of, well, I call the logger chief, but someone that reviews the dive logs after each dive or at the end of the cruise to just check for adherence to conventions and in conformance to what you would like to have. So with